Good hay belongs under a roof. Wade Boone called from the road, not stacked outside for the wind to eat. Nellie Cross did not turn. She shoved the bale at her knees tight against the row, then stepped back to judge the gap between the hay and the barn's north wall. 6 milk cows shifted behind the boards. Those cows paid for flour, lamp oil, winter salt, and the wages of the girl beside her with straw caught in her dark braid. Elsie Reed glanced toward the road. Wade sat straight in his saddle, wrapped in a brown cattle coat. 2 ranchers had stopped beside him, smiling as though Nellie had built the wall for their entertainment. "We could move it inside," Elsie said quietly. Nellie lifted another bale by its twine. "Inside hay won't stop, outside wind." Wade heard her. "Wind doesn't chew, Mrs. Cross." Nellie settled the bale on the lower course. "It takes less when it has to chew first." One rancher laughed. Wade looked along the hay already stacked against the north and west sides of the barn. "You'll rot your siding," he said, "and spoil good feed before Christmas. That is why it doesn't touch the boards." Between the barn and the hay ran a narrow space wide enough for air and a careful person. Flat stones raised the lowest bales from the damp ground. The wall leaned outward, not toward the timber. "Still looks like feed for the wind," Wade said. He touched his hat and rode on. The others followed, carrying their amusement toward the feed store. Elsie watched them disappear. "They'll tell everyone." They were going to talk whether we worked or not. Nellie handed her a piece of chalk. "Mark 12 on the slate." Elsie wrote beneath the heading she had ruled that morning, "Weather Row." 12 bales formed the outer face where rain or driven snow would strike first. Behind them sat 36 better bales, dry and tight, arranged so they could be removed from the barn side if the feed shed became unreachable. 36 was not much for 6 cows, but it could keep them fed several days if a storm buried the path. Nellie's late husband had shown her such walls in winter camps north of Casper. He had never called it clever. He had called it one more thing a person did before the sky gave them no choice. She climbed the short ladder and pulled his old freight canvas across the top. Sun had bleached it nearly gray, but the seams held. Elsie passed up rope, and Nellie tied the cover to stakes beyond the wall so it would shed water without sealing the hay. By noon, both women had straw inside their sleeves and dust in their throats. They should have been loading butter for town. Nellie knew what missing the delivery would cost, but the north wind was sharpening. Butter could wait one day. Winter would not. They ate cold biscuits beside the milkroom door, then began the western section. Elsie struggled with the heavier bales but never complained. When Nellie showed her how to turn one on its edge before lifting, the girl copied the motion and managed the next alone. "Mark 36 dry," Nellie said. Elsie chalked the number on the slate and drew a line beneath it. A gust crossed the basin hard enough to bend the yellow grass flat. Loose hay spun from the unprotected south corner, but behind the new wall, the air barely stirred. Inside, the cows shifted once and settled. Elsie smiled. They felt it. They usually do before people. The wind struck again, stronger. The freight canvas snapped overhead. Nellie looked up as one rope pulled tight, then another. The top row shuddered. "Back away," she ordered. Elsie stepped clear. A bale tipped forward, slid down the angled face, and landed square across the north barn door. The fallen bale had not broken the door, but it had wedged itself beneath the lower hinge hard enough that Nellie could not move it alone. She hooked both hands beneath the twine. "Lift when I say." Elsie crouched opposite her. Together they raised one end, rolled the bale onto its edge, and dragged it clear before the cows inside began crowding toward the noise. The door opened only a hand's width. The shifted top row had pressed the frame inward. Nellie ran her fingers along the jamb, then looked up at the wall. Too straight. Elsie stared at the stack they had spent all morning building. "We take it down." That corner? Yes. They worked before the next gust could make the decision for them. Nellie removed the upper bales while Elsie carried the slate and marked each one as it came down. Beneath the canvas, most of the hay remained pale and sweet-smelling. 2 bales at the outer edge were not. Their lower corners had darkened where rainwater from the previous night had collected against the ground. Nellie pushed her thumb into one. The hay felt cool and heavy, and a faint sour smell clung beneath the fresh-cut grass. Elsie's face tightened. "Mr. Boone was right. About those 2, Nellie sliced the twine and pulled apart the damp layers. No heat had built inside them yet, but they would not remain safe if restacked among dry hay. "We feed these first," she said, "and we raise every bottom row another inch." The two bales went through the north door and into separate feeding racks. On the slate, Elsie changed the dry reserve from 36 to 34. The number looked smaller than Nellie liked. She chose flat stones from beside the milkhouse and laid them beneath the dismantled corner. Then she reset the lower bales at a gentler outward angle, leaving a space behind them wide enough for air to pass without making a wind tunnel. Elsie knelt beside the gap. "How do we know if it is enough?" "We don't guess." Nellie tore narrow strips from an old flour sack and tied them to 3 nails along the barn siding. If the cloth hung limp, the space held damp air. If it snapped straight, the gap was funneling too much wind. The strips moved lightly. "Enough to breathe," Nellie said, "not enough to bite." They continued around the west side. Nellie showed Elsie how to press a bare palm beneath the canvas after rain, how to smell for souring hay, and how to look for a dark line rising from the bottom of a bale. At the leeward wall stood a small square hatch that had once been used for passing milk cans. Nellie cleared the crates beneath it and built the nearest hay section in removable rows, keeping the path inside the barn free of buckets and tools. She threaded a rope loop around the first 4 bales. "If the big doors freeze, we pull these from inside," she said. Elsie wrote "side hatch" beneath the new row on the slate and drew 4 small squares beside it. Rain returned before dusk. It tapped the patched roof, then ran from the old freight canvas in narrow streams. Nellie and Elsie waited beneath the eaves, checking the wall every few minutes. The siding remained dry. Water fell beyond the stones. The flour sack strips moved steadily, and none stuck damp against the boards. Elsie checked the lowest bales with both hands. Still dry. For the first time that day, Nellie let herself nod. Then sleet began striking the western canvas. A sharp crack sounded beneath the stacked hay. One of the new support braces split at its center. The west corner shifted, leaned inward, and began sliding toward the only clear passage to the side hatch. The west corner moved less than a foot, but that was enough to close half the passage beside the barn. Nellie shoved her shoulder against the lower row. The bales did not move. "Bring the pry bar," she told Elsie. The girl returned with the iron bar and 2 lengths of split pine. Sleet ticked against the canvas while Nellie wedged the iron beneath the leaning brace. "Not the top. We lower it from the bottom." Elsie planted 1 pine length against the stones. Nellie lifted with the bar, and together they eased the corner down 1 bale at a time until the weight settled safely onto the ground. The broken brace lay between them, split through its center. Nellie measured the opening beside the side hatch. It was still passable, but barely. "Another inch inward and we lose the lane," Elsie said. It was the first time the girl had named the danger before Nellie explained it. They cut 2 replacement braces from cottonwood and rebuilt the corner in shorter staggered rows. By midday the sleet had passed, but the wind remained. Nellie tied fresh flour sack strips along the siding and hung loose chaff from 3 nails at the outer edge. "Watch the air," she said. The strips nearest the corner snapped toward the milkroom door. Chaff streamed through the gap in a narrow line. Elsie followed it with her eyes. We made a funnel. Cold air was slipping around the new brace and driving straight toward the place where they cooled and strained the milk. Nellie had solved one problem and built another. She removed 3 bales and reset them at opposing angles, creating a shallow return that bent away from the door. Elsie moved the cloth strips while Nellie shifted the foundation stones. On the 3rd attempt, the strips lifted, trembled, and fell. "Now," Elsie asked. "Now it spends itself before it reaches the door." Elsie drew the western return on the slate and added a chalk arrow for the wind. The next squall came late that afternoon. It rolled over the basin carrying dust, dry grass, and a cold edge sharp enough to sting Nellie's cheeks. Wade Boone was riding home along the road when he saw the canvas flatten against the stack. He reined in. The wind struck the barn broadside. At the unprotected south wall, dust burst through the cracks and a loose milk pail rattled across the floor. Behind the hay wall, the cloth strips moved but did not snap. The air in the milkroom remained steady. Inside the main stall, the cows raised their heads, then returned to chewing. One cow had always crowded away from the north wall during hard wind. This time she did not move. Elsie stood beside Nellie in the passage. They felt it, the girl whispered, and they stayed. Wade dismounted and walked to the outer edge of the wall. He pressed a hand against a protected bale, then leaned toward the airflow gap. Still dry, he asked. Elsie answered before Nellie could. 34 dry, 2 fed early. No new damp. Wade looked at the slate in her hands, then through the open north door. The cows were quiet, and the lantern flame near the stall burned straight instead of pulling sideways. Barn's calmer, he said. Nellie waited. He did not apologize or praise the wall. He only studied the staggered corner. That return is doing more than I expected. It was not much, but Elsie heard it. Her smile appeared after Wade rode away. By evening, all 34 reserve bales remained dry. Nellie let Elsie make the final inspection alone. The girl checked the foundation stones, canvas ropes, and cloth strips. She found one loose knot and retied it without being told. Freezing rain began after dark. At first, it whispered against the roof. Then the drops hardened, striking the barn like thrown seed. Nellie stepped outside with the lantern raised. The old freight canvas bowed beneath the ice. A seam near the western corner stretched white, then opened with a ripping sound from one end of the wall to the other. Cold rain poured through the split directly above the protected rows. Nellie reached the western corner before the split widened. Lantern inside, she told Elsie. Bring cord, the flour sack patches, and the short ladder. Rain struck her hat brim and ran down the back of her coat. She climbed onto the lower row, one boot pressed against a stone, and caught the loose canvas before the wind could peel it away from the entire wall. The cloth had torn through an old sun-bleached seam. Elsie returned carrying the ladder against one shoulder. Wade Boone came through the gate behind her, leading his horse by the reins. I saw the canvas go, he said. Nellie did not waste breath asking why he had come. Hold the ladder. Wade planted both hands against it, while Nellie crawled high enough to pull the torn edges together. Elsie passed up cord and square patches, cut from old feed sacks. The canvas bucked beneath Nellie's knees. Ice gathered along the edge and broke away in clear chips. Left side lower, Elsie called. Water is running under the fold. Nellie shifted the patch. Elsie was right. They worked through 2 torn seams before the rain weakened. By then, Nellie's fingers were too stiff to tie a clean knot, and Wade had stopped offering advice. He held the ladder, passed rope, and followed Nellie's directions without argument. When they lowered the canvas, 4 bales beneath the split had already darkened. Nellie opened one with a hay knife. The center was still dry, but the outer layers had taken enough water to spoil if sealed back inside the wall. 4 out, she said. Elsie erased 34 from the slate and wrote 30. The damaged bales went into the barn to be fed before they could sour. Nellie restacked the remaining reserve, then covered the patched seam with a second overlapping strip. The freight canvas looked different now. 2 pale squares crossed its gray surface, and the new cord was brighter than the old rope her husband had tied years before. By nightfall, the rain had passed. Wade remained long enough to help lift the last wet bale through the north door. Inside, the barn smelled of warm cattle, damp wool, and fresh-cut hay. Elsie set a pan of beans on the small stove, while Nellie rubbed feeling back into her hands. Wade stood near the north stall, watching the cows eat. My cattle push to the south wall in weather like this, he said. Nellie poured coffee into 3 tin cups. These used to. He accepted the cup. They are quieter. The wind is quieter. Wade looked toward the hay wall. I thought the space behind it would hold damp. It would, if we packed it tight. He nodded once. I was wrong about that. It was not the apology Elsie seemed to be waiting for, but it changed the room. They ate beans from shallow bowls with broken biscuits crumbled into the broth. No one mentioned the feed store laughter. Wade asked Elsie how she marked the wet rows, and she explained the chalk arrows, the cloth strips, and the difference between cold damp and ordinary night chill. He listened without smiling. When Elsie finished, Nellie handed her the slate. You make the morning check. Alone. You found the runoff before I did. Elsie held the chipped slate carefully. Then I will check every lower corner. Wade set down his cup. You have taught her well. Nellie looked at the girl rather than him. She learns well. For a few quiet minutes, the storm seemed to have left them something better than dry hay. Then the temperature dropped. By dawn, the yard had hardened under a thin white crust. Elsie made the inspection before breakfast and returned with 30 dry bales marked on the slate. Nellie followed her outside to study the first powder snow. Along the north wall, it lay flat. At the western end, however, the new angled return had caught the wind differently than the earlier squalls. Snow curled around the outer corner, crossed the narrow passage, and gathered in a pale ridge. The ridge ran straight toward the side hatch. Nellie pushed a shovel blade into it. The snow was already packing underneath. Elsie looked from the drift to the hatch. That is our emergency lane. The next gust lifted more powder from the meadow and laid it across the same line. Nellie drove a willow stake into the white ridge beside the side hatch. Elsie planted another 6 feet farther west, where the powder first curved around the end of the hay wall. Together they stretched twine between the stakes and watched fresh snow cross beneath it. The drift was not random. Each gust struck the straight western end, curled inward, and dropped its load where the emergency lane narrowed. What had protected the barn from wind was directing snow toward the one opening Nellie meant to preserve. Elsie held the chipped slate under her coat. If this were a real storm, the hatch would disappear. Nellie pushed the shovel deeper. The upper powder gave way, but the bottom had already begun hardening into a packed shelf. Before the main doors did, she said, they cleared the lane, then waded through another gust. Snow returned to the same place. Wade rode in while Nellie was measuring the distance from the wall's end to the hatch. He dismounted and studied the stakes. You found trouble. I built it. You can shorten the wall and give the west wind a straight path to the barn. He looked across the open basin, then moved the end outward. That may throw the drift farther from the hatch. Nellie disliked the word because it was honest. She and Elsie carried loose chaff into the yard and released handfuls at different points along the wall. Most of it spun around the final corner and swept directly across the lane. Elsie drew the path in chalk. It turns too sharply. Nellie studied the line, then marked 3 staggered positions beyond the existing end. Instead of one straight corner, they would build a broken spur. Each short section angled away from the hatch. The gaps would bleed strength from the wind before it could curl inward. It meant dismantling work they had already done. Sometimes people call preparation foolish because the danger has not yet arrived to explain it. They see effort, cost, and inconvenience, but not the disaster being kept at a distance. Have you ever had to trust what you knew while everyone around you believed you were wrong? Nellie pulled the first bale free. By noon, the western end lay in pieces across the yard. Elsie reset foundation stones while Nellie shifted the outer rows into 3 staggered sections. The old shoulder injury she rarely mentioned began pulling beneath her coat, but she kept lifting. A cloud bank thickened over the western ridge. 2 bales slipped from the canvas during the rebuilding and landed in wet snow. Their lower faces darkened before Elsie could roll them onto stones. She cut one open and pressed both palms into the center. Wet through the corner, Nellie looked at the slate. Elsie erased 30 and wrote 28. At mid-afternoon, a feed store wagon passed on the road. The driver slowed when he saw the wall dismantled. Changing your mind, Mrs. Cross. Changing the wind? He laughed and continued toward town. Elsie watched him go. They will say the wall failed. Let them say it before the storm. They finished the first 2 sections before dusk. The third remained low and unsecured, its top row still lying beside the barn. A brief snowfall swept over the basin. Nellie and Elsie stood beside the hatch, watching the flakes cross the new staggered spur. The first section divided the wind. The second pushed it outward. Snow curved beyond the final stake and settled in the meadow, leaving only a shallow dusting in the emergency lane. Elsie stepped through the clear pocket and touched the hatch. It worked. It worked in a small wind. Still, it was enough to change the plan from hope to something they could test. They carried the last dry bales into position. Nellie's shoulder failed halfway through lifting one, and the bale dropped against her knee. Elsie caught the upper edge. You cannot finish that row alone. I am not alone. Together they raised it. The light was nearly gone when wagon bells sounded on the road. A freight driver pulled his team beside the gate, his beard crusted with frost. Stormline is moving faster than the station expected. He called. Wind hit Bitter Creek before sundown. They say the basin will be blind before morning. Nellie looked toward the unfinished third spur. 28 dry emergency bales remained outside. The final removable row had not yet been tied, covered, or secured to the side hatch rope. Wade rode through the gate before full dark. "Put the last row in the loft," he said. "I can bring 2 men and a wagon." Nellie stood beside the unfinished spur while darkness gathered over the basin. Moving the 28 dry bales inside would protect the feed from snow, but it would strip the west wall before the blizzard arrived. She looked at the clear pocket beside the side hatch. "No," she said, "they stay where they can do both jobs." Wade studied the sky. "If that canvas lets go, you may lose the wall and the feed. If the feed shed buries first, hay in the loft won't help us reach it." Elsie had already pulled the rope through the first removable row. Her hands kept working. "Then use my rope," Wade said. "Yours is too worn for ice." He returned from his saddle with a heavy coil. Nellie accepted it without apology and cut it into lengths. Wade held each bale steady while she and Elsie looped the rope low around the twine, leaving the ends inside the passage where they could be reached from the hatch. They marked the pull order on the slate. First row 4 bales, second row 4 more. Behind those stood the remaining 20, angled to keep breaking wind even after the front feed rows were removed. Nellie placed the hay knife on a hook beside the hatch. 2 lanterns went inside the barn. Elsie filled both water barrels to their rims, then cleared every bucket, stool, and milk can from the path between the hatch and the feeding racks. The freight canvas snapped overhead. Nellie climbed the short ladder and threaded Wade's rope through the old patch seams. Her shoulder burned each time she pulled the line tight. "You are favoring that arm," Wade said. "It still lifts. For now." Nellie tied the final knot, for as long as it must. The wind arrived in harder bursts. Dust and loose snow crossed the yard together, hiding the lower fence rails. Wade pointed toward the feed shed. "We still have light enough to clear that approach." "We have light enough for one job," Nellie said. "The wall is the job. Strengthening the main barn doors would have to wait. So would the drifted path to the feed shed. If the hay wall failed, she would have no second plan waiting behind it." Wade helped lift the final top bale into place. Then he fastened the outer corner with a knot Nellie's husband had once used on freight covers. "You know this tie?" she asked. "Every winter camp hand knew it." Nellie pulled the rope tight. Then every winter camp hand could have understood the wall. Wade looked at her, but the first snow struck before he answered. It came nearly sideways. He led his horse toward the gate. "My cattle shed is 6 miles east. I have to go." Nellie nodded. "Go before the road disappears." He turned at the gate. "If this holds, I'll say so. If it holds, the cows will say enough." He rode into the whitening dark. Elsie barred the north doors while Nellie checked the side hatch. The latch moved freely. The rope loops lay dry in the passage, and all 28 reserve bales remained under canvas. "You can sleep in the house," Nellie told her. "I'll stay here." Elsie set the cracked slate on a shelf beside the lantern. "No. This may be a long night. That is why 2 people measured the wall." Nellie looked at her. Elsie touched the chalked rows. "You taught me which bales are dry, which ropes come first, and how to read the drift. If the door freezes, I know what to do." Outside, wind struck the western spur. The barn timbers groaned, but the cows only lifted their heads. Nellie handed Elsie the slate. "You choose the first row if we have to pull feed." Elsie closed both hands around it. Nellie saw that she understood the difference between being useful and being trusted. The storm thickened until the lantern light no longer reached the fence. Snow packed against the main doors with a dull, steady weight. Nellie tried the bar once. The doors did not move. A crack of ice sealed the side latch. Above them, Wade's new rope drew tight. One old patch split loose, and the freight canvas began tearing away from the emergency rows. The canvas tore with a rifle crack, and snow drove through the opening above the first emergency row. Nellie seized the lantern. "Hold the hatch from inside." Elsie braced both boots against the floor and pulled on the iron latch. Ice had sealed it to the frame. Nellie wrapped a scarf across her mouth and forced herself into the narrow passage between hay and timber through the milk room service opening. The leeward pocket still existed. Snow boiled over the wall, but only a thin layer reached the ground beside the barn. Beyond the western spur, the yard had vanished beneath a rising white bank. The wall was taking the drift where she had asked it to. The loose canvas corner whipped above her. If the cloth peeled back another 6 feet, the emergency rows would take the storm directly. Nellie climbed onto the lowest bale, caught Wade's rope, and dragged it down. Ice coated the fibers. The rope cut through her gloves as she threaded it around the outer stake. Her injured shoulder gave once. She dropped to one knee but kept hold. Inside, Elsie struck the latch with the flat of the hay knife. Again, Nellie called. The second blow cracked the ice but did not free the hatch. Nellie tied the canvas low rather than restoring its height. The torn section sagged, yet it covered the marked rows and left the passage open beneath it. She drove the point of the hay knife between hatch and frame. Elsie pushed from inside. The latch broke free. The hatch opened 6 inches before the first pull rope stopped it. "It's frozen," Elsie said. Ice had bound the loop around the front 4 bales beneath the outer crust. There was no time to thaw it. "Stand back." Nellie sawed through the frozen line, cut the first bale free from the neighboring row, and heaved. Elsie caught it through the hatch. Together they dragged it inside. Her gloves had split at the palms, and bloodless fingers barely closed around the next rope. But the protected passage gave her room to keep working. By the 4th bale, a gap had opened in the wall, and wind tried to force snow through it. Elsie studied the slate beneath the lantern. A crack ran through the chalk squares, but the pull order remained visible. "Second row," she said. "Then we stop. The 20 behind it keep the wall standing." Nellie nodded. That was Elsie's decision now. They pulled 4 more bales through the hatch. The remaining stack settled into its staggered supports, lower but firm. Nellie closed the hatch and dropped the inner bar. 8 bales lay dry on the barn floor. The cows crowded forward at the smell, but none began the frightened shoving Nellie had seen in unprotected barns. Elsie divided the feed while Nellie checked the water barrels. Both remained full and unfrozen beneath blankets. By morning, the wind had polished the storm into silence. The north doors would not move. Snow stood nearly to their midpoint. The feed shed was only a rounded white shape beyond the yard, but the western spur had split the main drift. Beside the side hatch remained a narrow hollow marked by Nellie's boot tracks and the cut rope. Wade Boone arrived with 3 ranchers carrying shovels. Their own feed shed doors had frozen shut. One man had cut through a roof to reach his hay. Wade stopped beside the torn canvas, the emptied feed rows, and the 20 bales still dry behind them. Through the hatch, 6 cows stood eating. One rancher lowered his shovel and walked the full curve of the western spur before speaking. "No one got in here to help you," Wade asked. "No one was meant to," Nellie said. Elsie raised the cracked slate. 28 before the storm, 8 fed, 20 still dry. Wade pressed his palm into a surviving bale, then looked toward the buried feed shed. At the feed store 2 days later, ranchers gathered around the stove while snow melted from their boots. Wade stood where Nellie could hear him. "I said she was feeding the wind," he told them. "I was wrong. That wall fed her cattle after the storm locked every proper door she had." No one laughed. Then Wade turned to Nellie. "Will you mark the drift line around my cattle shed before the next snow?" Wade's question changed the room more than his confession had. The same men who had laughed at Nellie's wall now watched her instead of the stove. One of them asked how far a stack should stand from siding. Another wanted to know whether the western end should be straight or broken. Nellie looked at Wade. "I'll mark your drift line." He nodded. "Name your price." That mattered more than an apology. Advice given freely could still be treated as charity. Work paid for became judgment respected. Morning light found Nellie and Elsie riding to Wade's cattle shed with the cracked slate wrapped in cloth. Snow still covered the basin, but ridges and hollows had begun revealing where the storm had spent its force. Elsie planted stakes while Nellie watched loose powder travel along the ground. Together they marked the north pressure line, the western drift curve, and the leeward space where an emergency opening might remain clear. Wade did not interrupt. When Elsie corrected one stake by 3 feet, he moved it without questioning her. 7 days left fresh stake holes around 3 barns. 2 smaller ranchers had asked Nellie to examine their buildings. She charged each one fairly. The money replaced the butter sales she had missed and bought new canvas, stronger cord, and a proper tin brace for the slate. Elsie held the broken edges together while Nellie fastened the brace across the back. "You should put your name on it," Nellie said. Elsie looked up. "It's your record. It became ours before the storm." Nellie wrote "Nellie Cross" on one side of the tin strip, then handed the chalk to Elsie. The girl added reed beside it. 20 bales remained after the blizzard. Nellie rotated the outermost ones into the feeding racks and checked every center for damp. None had spoiled. The wall had consumed 8 bales during the emergency and sacrificed 6 earlier to rain and rebuilding. But it had preserved the herd, the barn, and enough reserve to carry them through the next cold spell. The torn freight canvas could no longer cover the full wall. Nellie cut away the worst section and stretched the strongest patch portion over the side hatch. Its mismatched squares and storm-torn edge remained visible above the opening that had saved them. When spring softened the basin, all 6 cows walked into pasture healthy. Butter orders returned. Elsie no longer received a seasonal envelope at the end of each month. Nellie gave her a written share of the dairy income and a key to every storage door on the place. "You don't owe me that," Elsie said. "No," Nellie answered. "You earned it." Summer grass grew high around the barn foundations. Before cutting season, Wade arrived with 2 wagons and asked whether Elsie could inspect the airflow gap at his shed. Nellie let Elsie answer. "I can be there Thursday," the girl said. By September, hay walls stood beside 4 smaller barns across the basin. None copied Nellie's first straight western corner. Each had staggered ends, raised foundation stones, loose canvas covers, and a removable row beside a protected hatch. The feed store began keeping heavy rope and canvas fasteners near the front counter. The owner called them winter wall supplies, though everyone knew whose wall he meant. The first hard wind of October arrived beneath a clear amber sky. Nellie and Elsie worked side by side at the cross barn, resetting the outer row and checking the repaired slate after every 12 bales. Across the basin, Wade was doing the same. The patched canvas above Nellie's hatch lifted once, settled against its ropes, and held. By the next October, the wind had more hay to chew than one widow could ever have stacked alone.